You're not dreaming. Not yet. That's the scary part, because in front of you, with the weight of incense thick in the air and frescoes peeling off walls like forgotten skin, sits a man dressed in velvet and gold, haunted by the very robes he wears. A pope, not the one from the smiling photographs or the balcony speeches on Easter morning. This one's eyes don't blink right. This one has been awake too long. He was born in silence. Not the kind you'd wish for in a quiet cradle, but the kind that hangs between walls where no one dares to cry. Somewhere in the soft village or the brinelet. A place where you weren't born for destiny, you were born to. His name doesn't matter. Not yet. Hear many by the time this is over. Urban, Innocent, Boniface, Clement. Names like dried wax, melted and reshaped by time. What matters is the chair, the cathedra Petri, the throne of Peter. It looks eternal, marbled steps, crimson cushions, but the man who sits on it knows better when he shifts his weight, that it was built not to elevate a man, but to trap him. Because being pope in the Middle Ages wasn't glory. It was a gamble. It's 896 AD. Rome is boiling with summer rot. Pilgrims sleep in the shadow of collapsed aqueducts, whispering prayers with teeth missing from famine. The Tiber River runs low, a thick green vein barely pulsing through the city's stone skeleton. And in the middle of it all, Formosus. He is dead. Very dead. But that's not the problem. The problem is he's been dead for 9 months, and now they're dragging his body back out. Not for honor, not for peace, for trial. Yes, trial. A corpse, pulled from the tomb, dressed in full papal regalia, sat upright on a throne. And put on trial by his successor. They called it the Cadaver Synod. Imagine the candles lit. The cathedral echoing with distant chanting. And in the center, a rotting figure, jaw wired shut so it won't fall open mid-accusation, surrounded by judges who dare not look him in the face. The Pope who ordered this, Stephen VI. A man trembling with too much power and not enough time. Formosus was accused of perjury, illegally transferring sees, and of course, the vague, terminal sin, ambition. But what they were really accusing him of was being alive at the wrong time. Because medieval popes weren't shepherds. They were pawns, bishops, sometimes even mercenaries. The title was holy, the life was not. Every papal election was a death sentence with incense. Formosus had enemies. The powerful Roman family of Spoleto, the Frankish kings, Byzantine claws reaching westward. In that century, popes rose and fell faster than crops. One was strangled in prison. Another vanished entirely. Most reigned for less than 2 years. And you wonder why sleep is hard. They put a deacon beside the corpse to speak for him. His voice trembled through the empty basilica. Every question was met with silence, every answer implied by rot. And when it ended, they stripped the dead pope of his robes, cut off the fingers he used to bless the people, and threw him in the river like a broken statue. The people watched. Not horrified, not even surprised. They knew Rome had become a theater where holiness was a costume worn briefly, bloodily. Later, Stephen VI would be imprisoned and strangled himself. Formosus's body would be pulled back from the river, buried, exhumed again, reburied. Even in death, popes were not free. There's a strange kind of quiet that comes when justice becomes ritual and revenge becomes law. That was just 1 year. By the 11th century, the papacy would become less about God and more about war. Between the Vatican walls, prayers echoed alongside screams. Their beds by rival factions. Their supporters were beaten in the streets. Papal elections involved knives and bribes, often in that order. Because Rome was never really one city. It was a battlefield stitched into marble. And every pope, every single one, was a man pretending to wear God's voice while listening over his shoulder for footsteps. It's hard to call that holy. But maybe that's the point. Maybe being a pope back then wasn't about being close to God. Maybe it was about surviving long enough to pretend you still believed in him. In the end, no one wanted to be pope. They just couldn't say no without bleeding. The title was power, yes, but the kind that coils around your neck the moment you touch it. And sleep? Well, sleep was for the dead. And even they were sometimes called back. The mistake people make is thinking power protects you. But in the Middle Ages, power was just a more elaborate form of exposure, a crown that didn't keep you warm, a throne that didn't stop the rats from chewing at your door. Had a palace, yes, but it was often crumbling. The walls wept in winter. Ceilings sagged from centuries of forgotten rain. The guards could be bribed. Cooks could be loyal to someone else. And every candle you lit could throw a shadow shaped like betrayal. By the time the 10th century began folding into itself, the papacy was no longer simply caught between kings and emperors, it was the battlefield. The office was passed like a cursed inheritance from one faction to another, not just spiritual leaders, but political hostages, installed and removed by whatever noble family held the sharpest knife that month. And that knife, more often than not, belonged to a woman named Marozia. She wasn't a pope, no. She made popes. In the early 900s, Marozia, the daughter of the powerful Roman Select, became the de facto ruler of Rome. Not with armies, with bloodlines. She married power, birthed it, poisoned it, held it like a rosary made of, and through it all, she molded the papacy. She installed one lover as pope. Then her son. Then her grandson. They called it the Saeculum Obscurum, the dark age of the papacy, not because of what people didn't know, but because of what they couldn't say. You could be a bishop one morning and a corpse by evening. You could kiss a pope's ring and find that same pope hanging in chains by nightfall. Rome had never been so quiet. And yet never so brutal. She began to decay from within. The selling of church offices ran rampant. You wanted to be a cardinal? Pay enough gold. Want to be bishop of a wealthy diocese? There's a fee for that. Want to be pope? Lineage, leverage, and luck, preferably all three. Holiness was auctioned. The theological rot spread outward. Priests with concubines. Monks who couldn't read scripture. Bishops who had never seen their own diocese. But again, this isn't a shock story. It's not told to make you gasp. It's told to make you listen. Because something happens when people wear God's face and sell it by the hour. Something quiet. Like trust evaporating. In the monasteries, where some still clung to older forms of discipline, the rot smelled stronger. The monks wrote letters, appeals for reform, but most went unread. Until one voice found its way through the cracks. A man from Burgundy. A monk named Cluny. Or rather, a monastery named Cluny. In 910, the Abbey of Cluny was founded with a simple idea, that the church should be free from secular control. That monks should answer to God, not to kings or local lords. And while the popes in Rome bled or vanished, the Cluniac monks began whispering a different kind of power, one that didn't depend on armies or coin, but on reputation. It spread. Slowly, as all real things, and then something shifted. In 1049, a new pope ascended, Leo IX, not elected by bribes or family pressure, but hand-picked by the Holy Roman Emperor. He wasn't perfect, but he was different. He brought reformers with him. And more importantly, he listened. He traveled across Europe, holding councils, deposing, excommunicating those who bought their way in. And behind him, the movement grew. Then came Hildebrand, not pope yet. Not even a bishop. Just a monk. But a monk who had studied the chaos like scripture. He served under 5 popes, quietly crafting a new theology of authority, one that would redefine the papacy forever. His belief was simple, terrifying, but simple, that the pope was not merely a spiritual leader. He was the vicar of Christ. Not a servant of kings, but above them. It was the seed of a revolution. In 1073, Hildebrand became Pope Gregory VII. And everything changed. He issued the Dictatus Papae, a declaration that the Pope alone could depose emperors, that the Roman Church had never erred and never would, that he held the ultimate authority on earth. It wasn't arrogance, it was armor. He had seen what happened to popes who served empires. Now he was building a throne that would outlast them. But thrones don't float. They're built on bones. And in 1075, Gregory VII excommunicated Emperor Henry IV for appointing bishops, a direct challenge to the Pope's authority. Henry laughed. Until he didn't. His nobles rebelled. His armies faltered. And in the snow-covered mountains of Canossa in 1077, the emperor walked barefoot to the Pope's door, dressed as a penitent, begging for absolution. The Pope waited 3 days before letting him in. The message was clear. The Pope wasn't just a bishop anymore. He was an empire unto himself. But, that's where the thread tightens. Because the higher the Pope rose above kings, the deeper the ground. Authority, after all, is only peaceful in theory. And the medieval world, with its cracked roads, its hunger, its constant wars, was never built for theory. So even as the Pope claimed he could crown and dethrone emperors, the assassins sharpened their blades. Even as he wrote bulls of holy power, his meals were tested for poison. And even as the crowds kissed his ring, some were measuring his coffin. Power is not safety. It never was. And being Pope, by now, it was like being the moon in a medieval sky. Worshipped, watched, but utterly alone. And always, just one eclipse away from darkness. They called it plenitudo potestatis, the fullness of power. To be Pope in the 12th century was to claim, without flinching, that you stood above kings and emperors, not as a rival, but as a necessary correction. If the crown veered, the tiara would realign it. If a ruler defied God, the Pope would remind the world who spoke for him. It was beautiful on parchment, terrifying in practice, because the closer a man stood to the divine, the more he became a mirror. And mirrors, in this world, cracked under too much light. Pope Innocent III understood this better than anyone. He was 37 when he took office in 1198. By papal standards, sharp, educated in law, fluent in scripture and politics alike. He didn't inherit the chair, he seized it. With clarity. With purpose, with a belief so total it left no room for sleep. Innocent believed the Pope wasn't just a shepherd. He was the sun, and the kings of the earth were mere moons, reflecting only what he chose to shine. Under him, papal authority bloomed like a sword pulled cleanly from its. He intervened in imperial succession, deposed monarchs, crowned others, forced princes to bend the knee not in battle, but in ritual humiliation. He even placed all of England under interdict, shutting down its churches, halting sacraments, burying the dead in silence, until its king surrendered. And the people, or rather, endured, because they had no choice. But power isn't about obedience, it's about tension. The kind that hums just under the skin, that makes people kneel, while still watching the exits. And Innocent knew it. He ruled like a man who expected betrayal before breakfast. He expanded papal bureaucracy, created new offices, new codes, new systems. Rome itself became more administrative than spiritual, with clerks shuffling parchment like soldiers loading weapons. The Pope became less a figure of faith, more a node of control. And yet, he feared, not for himself, but for the soul of Christendom. Because outside the marble walls, heresies were blooming. Quiet ones, local ones, movements that didn't shout, they whispered. The most dangerous was in southern France. The Cathars, they called themselves good Christians. They renounced wealth, rejected the material world, believed the church was corrupt, and that true holiness could only be found in simplicity. They didn't riot, they didn't blaspheme, they just lived differently, peacefully. And that was what made them so dangerous. Innocent sent preachers, debaters, letters. They came back with worry in their eyes. The Cathars couldn't be silenced because they didn't fear hell. They didn't need priests. They saw the Vatican as a relic, not a compass. So Innocent made a decision. He called for a crusade. Not to Jerusalem. Not to the Holy Land, to France, against fellow Christians. The Albigensian Crusade began in 1209. And it didn't end with arguments, it began with blood. When the city of Béziers refused to surrender its Cathar residents, the papal legate was asked how to distinguish the heretics from the faithful. His reply echoed down the centuries: kill them all, God will know his own. The massacre was total. And so was the silence that followed. Because what happens when the shepherd starts hunting his own flock? Innocent died in 1216. Not in disgrace, not in fear, but with the machine still humming. He had crafted a model of papal power so complete it no longer needed his voice to run. But the cost wasn't written in gold. It was etched into stone. The papacy had become a fortress, and every fortress, no matter how high its walls, eventually forgets what it was protecting. The 13th century came wearing a crown, but it limped. The Crusades up. The Holy Land slipped further and further away. Muslim forces reclaimed what had been taken. The Byzantines collapsed in slow motion. And still the popes preached glory, but fewer answered. There's a difference between divine fire and political smoke. People began to notice. Then came Frederick II. Emperor, genius, heretic, some whispered. A man who spoke 6 languages, kept Muslim advisors, and openly mocked papal decrees. Frederick didn't oppose the pope. He outgrew him. His own crusade for years. Promised to go. Didn't. Went eventually, and negotiated peacefully with Muslim leaders, returning from Jerusalem not with victory, but with a treaty. The pope excommunicated him anyway. Frederick ignored it. That was the breaking point. A war. Not a rebellion. Just indifference. The pope screamed. The emperor shrugged. Because the papacy had become too visible, too political, too earthly. Its spiritual authority, once unquestionable, now flickered. And behind the marble walls, a strange thing began to happen. Popes got paranoid. They moved. In 1309, under pressure and fear, the papal court left Rome. They set up residence in Avignon, in southern France. A quieter city, safer. More loyal. But also, smaller. For nearly 70 years, the popes ruled from there. It wasn't called exile. But it felt like it. Locals muttered that the church had been hijacked by French kings, that the pope was now a puppet, a bishop with better robes. Even in Avignon, the popes built palaces, painted ceilings, dined in gold. But the air was wrong. The incense didn't settle the same. The stones didn't echo, because something had been lost in translation. The pope wasn't in Rome. And Rome remembered. Back in the old city, weeds grew through broken stones. The Lateran Basilica, once the center of Christian authority, cracked like an abandoned library. Thieves roamed its halls, stray dogs fought in its empty naves. Holiness needs a center, and without it, all that was left was a question. If the Pope can run, was he ever really chosen? The people didn't know, but the silence of Rome had started to whisper. You'd think silence means peace, but sometimes, it's what's left when the story has nothing human left to say. And that's where we are now. A papacy in exile. A city waiting. An empire folding into shadow. It still sucked to be pope, but now, it was starting to suck quieter. You can almost hear it now. Not the grandeur, not the choirs creaking. Of floorboards under heavy feet. Of old beams sagging under the weight of robes, secrets, and time. Avignon was supposed to be sanctuary, but in truth, it became something else entirely. A golden cage, a velvet exile. A city where the Pope still wore his ring, still blessed the world, but from behind shutters. The air in Avignon was different, heavy with wine, politics, and the murmurs of French court intrigue. The papal court had grown fat, not just in stomachs, but in paper. Bureaucrats like wasps, drawing up bulls, indulgences, decrees. Rome, meanwhile, sat like a scorned widow. Its basilicas fell into dust. Graffiti bloomed where processions used to march. People still prayed, yes, but they did so with an empty space where their shepherd used to be. The Bishop of Rome was no longer in Rome. And that emptiness grew teeth. For nearly 70 years, the Pope stayed in Avignon. 7 in total. All French, all cautious. They weren't heretics. They weren't monsters. They were managers, accountants of the divine. They restructured church income. Taxed dioceses across Europe. Sold indulgences in scrolls stamped with papal seals. They ran a church like you'd run a bank. And perhaps that was the plan. Because in times of fear, control feels holier than courage. But the world outside the palace was shifting. Whispers began to rise from Italy, from poets, monks, and even kings, that the papacy had become a shadow of itself, that a pope who feared to sit on Peter's chair in Rome could not claim to speak for Christ. The pressure built, then loudly, and in 1377, under Pope Gregory XI, the papacy finally returned, back to Rome. Back to dust, decay, and the aching arms of a city that had waited too long. But something was wrong. The return wasn't triumphant. It was nervous, as if the Pope had crossed a river only to find the bridge behind him collapsing. And then, a year later, Gregory XI died. The seat was empty again. The conclave was held in Rome, and the Romans, starved of papal presence for generations, surrounded the palace, demanding an Italian pope. Not French, not foreign. One of their own. Inside the locked doors, the cardinals deliberated. Not in peace, in terror. They elected an Italian, Urban VI. He was unstable. Devout, yes. Intelligent. But paranoid. Prone to fury, he accused his own cardinals of treason, threatened them with torture. Some fled. Then, they declared the election invalid, and elected a new pope. A French one. Clement VII. He set up his court in Avignon. Again. And just like that, there were two popes, both claiming to be the rightful voice of God, both excommunicating each other. It was called the Western Schism, and for the next 40 years, Christendom would be divided. Not by heresy, not by theology, but by politics, geography, loyalty. Kings chose sides, some followed Rome. Others, Avignon. The people were confused. Imagine kneeling at Mass, receiving communion, and not knowing if the priest was ordained by the true pope, or by a fraud. Imagine dying with your confessions heard by a bishop whose authority might be invalid. It gnawed at the bones of faith, and the popes, they weren't humbled by the division, they escalated it. Each raised taxes to fund their legitimacy, each sold indulgences faster, built palaces grander, declared wars holier, and the people, those still clinging to the idea of salvation, watched as the keys to heaven were tossed between two men shouting across the Then, it soured. In 1409, a council was held in Pisa to resolve the crisis. Church leaders gathered, debated, and decided to depose both popes. They elected a third, Alexander V, but neither of the other two stepped down, so now, 3 popes, each with their own court. Each with their own supporters. It was no longer a question of who spoke for God. It was whether anyone could. And beneath that question, a deeper silence, the kind that doesn't just disturb faith, the kind that unroots it. Outside the Vatican palaces, whichever one you picked, the world was growing darker. The Black Death had swept through decades earlier, killing millions. Whole towns vanished, fields turned fallow. Children grew up in cities that no longer remembered their names, and still the church sold hope. Pay a coin. Light a candle. Pray the right words to the right pope, even as the world cracked. In Paris, Oxford, and Prague, scholars began to whisper that perhaps the church had no monopoly on grace, that perhaps salvation was simpler, quieter, something between man and God alone. That whisper would become a scream. But not yet. First, the papacy had to break, fully. In 1414, a great council was convened at Constance. The chaos could no longer be ignored. One pope was deposed. One resigned. One refused and was excommunicated. And a new pope was elected, Martin V. Unity, at last. But not healing. Because by now, the damage wasn't administrative. It was invisible. Trust had eroded. Not in doctrines, but in the men who wore them. The Pope had become a political figure, indistinguishable from a king, but without the honesty of a crown. And for those who still believed, belief now came with a cough. A hesitation, a pause before saying amen. You might wonder, what did it feel like to be Pope during this? Sit on the throne of Peter and know that half the world doubted you even belonged there. To sign bulls in the name of Christ, while your rival did the same in another city. To hear your own name, chanted in Latin, and know that somewhere else, another congregation was chanting a name. That's the curse, not the robes. Not the rituals, the knowing. That you are being watched, not with reverence, but with calculation. Not as a father, as a flaw. The papacy had survived exile, division, scandal. But it hadn't escaped the truth. That power, once fractured, never fully returns whole. It just learns how to hide the cracks. When Martin V entered Rome in 1420, it wasn't a triumph. It was a return. Quiet. Dust choked, half symbolic. He rode through a city that had been a capital of faith, then a ghost of memory, then a battlefield of the Roman streets, cracked, overgrown, echoing with silence, had waited over a century to hold a pope again. But even as the banners fluttered and incense burned in thin, curling ribbons, something felt hollow. The Western Schism was over. The chair was whole, but the soul? Not yet. And the man in white knew it. Martin didn't preach fire, he preached infrastructure. He restored aqueducts, repaired basilicas, rebuilt bridges that had collapsed while the church tore itself in two. But every stone laid was a quiet that something had been shattered. Trust wasn't a doctrine you could rewrite. It wasn't a council you could summon. It had to be grown back, brick by hesitant brick. But the cracks weren't just in buildings, they were in time. Because as the 15th century deepened, Europe in ways the church could no longer soothe. The Renaissance had arrived, and with it came something far more dangerous to the papacy than war or plague. Curiosity. Before, men looked up, heaven was the answer, and Rome held the key. But now, they looked around. To art. To anatomy, to the shape of planets and the shadows of bones. Human beings stopped asking what would save them, and started asking what they were. Florence painted angels with real muscles. Universities dissected corpses in candlelit rooms, and somewhere it began to look less like God's voice, and more like a gatekeeper to an older world. The Vatican responded the only way it knew how. Popes like Eugene IV and Nicholas V tried to embrace the new dawn. Nicholas built libraries, invited artists to the court, and dreamed of a Rome that was both holy and human. But behind the marble smiles, fear lingered, because what happens when knowledge no longer needs permission? Then came Pope Alexander VI. And the story shifts again. His real name was Rodrigo Borgia. Spanish, clever, ruthless, the kind of man who didn't blink when the chessboard bled. When he became pope in 1492, it wasn't a spiritual moment. It was a transaction. He had bought the conclave, literally. Votes exchanged for gold, promises, blackmail. And once he sat on the throne, he ruled like a lord in a land with no God. His papacy was infamous, not because he was worse than others, but because he stopped pretending. He had children. Multiple. A mistress he installed in the Vatican. He granted land and power to his son Cesare, who murdered, conquered, and whispered of empire. Rome under Alexander was less a city of saints, more a stage of appetites. Banquets, assassinations, affairs behind confessionals. The marble floor grew slick with secrets. But here's the part no one says aloud. People weren't shocked. They were tired of pretending, who no longer even bothered to wear the mask. The papacy had become theater, and the audience was in the countryside. New voices began, not kings, not cardinals, but monks, scholars, preachers. Men like Jan Hus, burned alive in 1415 for daring to say that the Bible mattered more than the Pope's opinion of it. And one man in particular, still quiet, still unknown, was reading scripture in a cold room in Wittenberg. His name was Martin Luther. But we're not there yet. Back in Rome, the popes doubled down. After Alexander VI came Julius II, the warrior pope, a general in robes. He led troops into battle, sword in one hand, crucifix in the other. He commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, not for devotion, but for legacy. He didn't just want to serve God. He wanted to be remembered by him. Under Julius, the Vatican became a fortress of art and ambition. But beneath the frescoes, something still rotted. Simony had never died. Indulgences, those spiritual IOUs, were sold like carnival tickets. The more you paid, the faster your soul could skip the line to heaven. It wasn't theology anymore, it was math. And math, when done out loud, starts to sound like proof. Luther, now a monk and professor, had heard enough. In 1517, he wrote his 95 Theses, not a declaration of war, but a list of questions, doubts. He nailed them to the church door in Wittenberg. A wooden echo, the sound that started an earthquake. Rome didn't take it seriously. At first, it had survived rebellions before. Heresies came and went like bad winters. But this was different. Because the printing press had arrived. And suddenly, Luther's questions weren't whispers. They were pamphlets, sermons, translations. They spread like smoke in a dry forest. People began to, not between popes, but between obedience and clarity. And many chose clarity. The Vatican tried to respond. They summoned Luther, ordered him to recant. He refused, so they excommunicated him. But he didn't burn. He printed. And others followed. Calvin, Zwingli, Tyndale. The Reformation wasn't a lightning strike. It was slow, persistent, merciless. And at its center, the idea that the Pope was not infallible, that he could be wrong. So, what was it like to be Pope then? To wake in the marble halls of a city built to outshine heaven, and know that your voice no longer reached every ear. To see cathedrals burn in Germany, bishops defect in England, monasteries dissolve in Switzerland. To write bulls of excommunication and see them ignored, laughed at, tossed into rivers. That's not just power slipping. That's identity disintegrating. By the time Pope Leo X died in 1521, the Protestant movement was unstoppable. And his final words, "God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." He wasn't joking. And maybe that's the most honest thing a pope said all century, because to be a medieval pope was never truly about peace, or, it was about surviving. And by the dawn of the 16th century, the chair wasn't holy, it was haunted. It is one thing to lose control. It is another to pretend you haven't. The papacy, now entangled in the smoke of the Reformation, stood at a strange crossroads, too sacred to admit weakness, too human to deny it. The 16th century was no longer medieval by map or medicine, but in the Vatican halls, in those dim corridors where blood had dried into the grain of the walls, it was still the Middle Ages, just dressed in Renaissance clothing. The robes were heavier, the gold was brighter. But underneath, the silence was louder than ever. After the death of Leo X, his successors scrambled to put out fires they no longer understood. Fires that weren't just doctrinal, they were psychological. This wasn't just a crisis of belief, it was a crisis of meaning. Enter Pope Adrian VI, a rare outsider, not Italian, but Dutch, not from a dynasty, but from scholarship. A man who had studied reform, feared corruption, and believed the papacy could be made holy again. He lasted barely. Adrian tried to admit fault, publicly acknowledged that the church had erred, that the rot wasn't imagined, that Luther wasn't entirely wrong. And for that, Rome rejected him. The curia, that ancient machinery of Vatican administration, tightened its grip. No more apologies. No more weakness. The next pope, Clement VII, knew better. He wore the robes like armor. But God doesn't play by palace rules. In 1527, the sky turned red. Rome, the eternal city, not by infidels, not by heretics, but by fellow Christians. And Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, marched on the city. They were unpaid, half-starved, and filled with rage. And when they entered Rome, they did not stop. Nuns were violated in their cloisters. Priests were streets. Churches were desecrated, relics shattered, altars defiled. Even the Sistine Chapel, that masterpiece of divine ambition, echoed with screams. Clement VII fled into Castel Sant'Angelo, the fortress by the Tiber. For months, he hid. Just as a man. Watching the Vatican burn. That year, the papacy died a second death, not in theology, but in symbol. Because how can the city of God be looted by its own? How can the vicar of Christ sit behind stone walls and pillage beneath his windows? There are questions incense cannot answer. After the ashes cooled, the papacy faced a choice, reform or retreat deeper into grandeur. They chose both, and that's where the story fractures again. The Council of Trent began in 1545. It would last 18 years. It was the Church's official response to the Reformation, but not with apology, with definition. It clarified doctrines, strengthened discipline, rejected Protestant claims with a sharpened theological knife. Faith alone could not save you. No, the Pope's authority was not optional. No, Scripture was not self-explanatory. The message was clear. This is not a conversation. It was counter-reformation. A wall built not to invite, but to contain. And behind that wall, a new kind of pope began to emerge. Less king. More manager. Less holy father. More administrator of damage. One of them, Pope Paul IV, would take things further. He was zealous, severe. He created the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the index of forbidden books, a growing blacklist of ideas too dangerous for the faithful. He empowered the Roman Inquisition, giving it teeth. He segregated Jews into ghettos in Rome, forced them to wear badges, ordered synagogues demolished. This wasn't merely theology, it was fear wearing holy robes. And fear, once institutionalized, starts to look like normalcy. The popes that followed walked carefully, too careful to fall, too cautious to fly. They were no longer spiritual giants, they were survivors in a shrinking world. Because Europe was changing, science was blooming. Empires were expanding. And while the Vatican obsessed over controlling thought, Galileo was building a telescope. In 1610, he published Starry Messenger. It described mountains on the moon. Moon's implications clear, Earth was not the center. The heavens did not revolve around us. The Pope at the time, Paul V, was not amused. Rome summoned Galileo. Not to learn, to silence. In 1633, under Pope Urban VIII, Galileo stood before the Inquisition. An old man. Tired, brilliant, he recanted under pressure, spoke the words they forced into his mouth. Legend holds he whispered as he left. E purus I move, and yet it moves. That's what it had come to. A pope denying movement, while the universe refused to stop. And still, they wore the robes, they held the scepter, they walked beneath the golden dome and pretended the sky hadn't shifted. Because in the end, it was never about truth, it was about continuity. If the Pope fell, then perhaps the whole world would remember that he was just a man. That maybe he always had been. By the end of the 17th century, the papacy had become a ghost, still seated, still speaking, but translucent in the face of time. The Enlightenment loomed, revolutions whispered. And the throne once held by Gregory, Innocent, Boniface, Urban, now creaked under the weight of centuries of contradiction. It still sucked to be pope. But now, it sucked differently. Before, the danger was knives, poisons, and exile. Now, it was irrelevance. The world no longer feared the pope. It was starting to forget him. And in some ways, that was worse, because power hates being disarmed. But it despairs at being ignored. There is a particular type of dread that doesn't shout. It lingers, the kind that haunts a palace where candles burn not out of devotion, but out of habit. By the 18th century, the papacy had become a shadow of its medieval self, still wrapped in silk, still encased in ceremony, but no longer the engine of terror or salvation. What had once been the furnace of Europe's soul now felt like a wax museum, reverent, elaborate, and eerily still. The world outside had changed. Irrevocably, kings no longer kneeled by instinct, philosophers no longer whispered. And the Pope, that once untouchable bridge between heaven and man, began to resemble something much more fragile. A man in a chair too old to move. The Enlightenment didn't storm the Vatican gates. It did something crueler. It simply went around them. New ideas bloomed, not in monasteries, but in salons, not in Latin, but in common tongues. Voltaire mocked the church with wit so sharp it bled without bruises. Diderot, Rousseau, and others treated religion not as gospel, but as sociology. And the Vatican, still clinging to its ancient rhythms, couldn't find the beat. The papal bulls kept coming. Declarations, condemnations, reaffirmations of authority. But every year, they echoed less. The printing press, once feared, had become the common man's, and where there is light, there is no need for someone to guide you out of the dark. Pope Clement XIV came to power in 1769. He inherited a throne surrounded not by swords, but by questions. And one of those questions had teeth. The Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, had once been the Vatican's elite, educators, defenders of Catholic orthodoxy. But they had grown too powerful. Too independent, too loyal to their own cause. European monarchs, especially in France, Portugal, and Spain, pressured Clement relentlessly. They demanded the order be suppressed. And in 1773, after months of internal agony, he signed the brief. The Jesuits were disbanded. Their properties seized. their members scattered. Clement's health deteriorated rapidly afterward. Some whispered he had been poisoned. Others that guilt simply did what no dagger could. His last days were spent in isolation, paranoid and shaken. Because that's what the papacy had become, a chess piece caught between kings too impatient for bishops. Then came the revolution. Not of doctrine, but of France. The church, long entwined with the monarchy, found itself swept away in a tide of liberty, equality, and guillotines. Clergy were stripped of wealth, churches were looted, bishops fled, and for the first time in centuries, the concept of a world without a pope began to feel imaginable. In Paris, Notre Dame was renamed the Temple of Reason. In the Vatican, the silence turned brittle. Pius VI watched the world tilt. He condemned the revolution, of course, called it a betrayal of natural order, but words don't slow mobs. And in 1798, French troops entered Rome. The Roman Republic was declared. The Pope was arrested. He was marched out of the city like a criminal, not a shepherd, hands bound, face pale, the last embers of divine authority flickering in his breath. He died a year later, in exile. No funeral. No legacy, just a footnote in a world now writing new rules. And yet, the chair remained. Even when no one was sitting in it. Because the papacy was stubborn. And so was time. Pope Pius VII took office in 1800, after the chaos dimmed. But he wasn't stepping into the world Gregory or Innocent knew. He was stepping into Napoleon's. The Emperor of the French had conquered. He didn't fear the Pope. He didn't hate him. He used him. In 1804, Pius VII was invited to Paris for Napoleon's coronation. He expected to place the crown upon the emperor's head, as tradition demanded. Instead, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands and crowned himself. It was a gesture so subtle, so complete, that no sword could have done more damage. The Pope smiled. He had to. But the message was clear. The throne of Peter no longer crowned kings. Kings crowned themselves. Later, Napoleon would imprison the Pope, like a relic he no longer needed. For 5 years, Pius VII remained a prisoner in Savona, then Fontainebleau. When he was finally released, he returned to Rome a broken man, venerated, yes, respected. But hollowed, because being pope no longer meant what it once did. There was no longer a divine right to rule. Only the fragile permission of empires. And still, the chair remained. That strange, ancient seat. Worn now. Less by time than by irrelevance. By the mid-19th century, Italy itself began to rise, not as scattered kingdoms, but as a nation. And Rome stood in the way. The Papal States, territories ruled directly by the Pope, were a thorn in the side of unification. Pius IX, who ruled longer than any other pope, saw it all. In 1848, revolution broke out. In 1870, Rome was captured. The Papal States dissolved. The Pope's army fell. And just like that, the Pope was no longer a king. No more soldiers. No more land. No more secular authority. The papacy had become symbolic, powerless, but still glowing with the memory of power. Pius IX retreated into the Vatican. Declared himself the prisoner of the Vatican. For decades, he refused to step foot outside the Leonine walls, because even though the world had changed, even though its crown, he could still remember what it felt like to be feared. And memory, for the papacy, was the last dominion it truly ruled. They still held councils, still defined doctrine. In 1870, the First Vatican Council declared the Pope infallible when speaking ex cathedra on matters of faith and morals. A strange irony. Now that he had lost his armies, his palaces, his lands, they made him untouchable, not in the world, but in words. The Pope could no longer command emperors. But he could never be wrong. An idea both powerful and tragic. Because who needs to be infallible, unless they fear being forgotten? There is a silence that comes after collapse. Not peace, not yet, but the kind of hush that lingers in a place after the crowd has gone. After the drums are packed away, and the firelight flickers just a little too long. That was the Vatican at the end of the 19th century. Still there, still dressed in robes. But hollowed by the weight of everything it no longer controlled. No papal states, no armies, no kings trembling before the keys of heaven. Just a pope. Alone behind stone walls. Infallible in name. Invisible in effect. The world had gone forward. And the chair of St. Peter had stayed still. Pope Leo XIII took the throne in 8. He was 70. Thin, scholarly. And when he walked into the Vatican chambers, he wasn't stepping into an empire. He was stepping into a mausoleum with candles still burning out of habit. Leo understood something most of the world no longer feared the papacy. But it might still listen, if it whispered in the right tone. He began to write. Encyclicals flowed from his desk like gentle arguments, not declarations of war, but persuasions. One in particular, Rerum Novarum, addressed the working poor, labor rights, industrialization. And for the first time in centuries, the Pope wasn't simply condemning the modern world, he was speaking into it. It didn't restore his lost crown. But it did something stranger. It made people think the Pope might matter again. Not as a king, but as a conscience, a quiet shift. Still, the Vatican remained a paradox. Holy on paper, trapped in marble. From the outside, it looked like continuity. But inside, something had changed. The popes had begun to age with purpose. Long reigns, thoughtful silences, less thunder, more fog. Their power wasn't over empires anymore, it was over memory. And that's the most dangerous kind. Then came 1929. And with it, the Lateran Treaty. A strange document, signed in neat ink under golden light. It did something unthinkable, something that would have shattered a medieval pope's mind. It made the Vatican a country. Not an empire, not a kingdom, of just 109 acres. A postage stamp of holiness, a city-state with no real borders, no peasants, no provinces, but with its own flag. Its own passport. Its own coins. The papacy had finally been distilled, not to nothing, but to symbolism. And the world accepted it. Because by now, most didn't expect popes to rule, they just wanted them to mean something. Then came the wars. The 20th century unfolded like a wound, and the popes, the 10th to Benedict XV, watched from behind windows. They blessed, they prayed. They mourned. But they did not command. Because even as bullets tore through Europe, the Pope could no longer lift a sword. Only a voice, and even that, echoed less than it used to. Pope Pius XII reigned during the Second World War. He was careful. Too careful, some say. He walked the edge of diplomacy like a man crossing a frozen lake at midnight. Knowing that one wrong word might shatter more than ice, he didn't denounce Hitler by name. He feared retaliation, feared the church would be crushed in lands where the swastika had replaced the cross. So he whispered. Letters. Encyclicals, behind closed doors, and the world waited for thunder that, some say he saved thousands, others say his silence cost millions. The truth lives somewhere in the spaces between. But what's certain is this: once, the Pope would have rallied armies, now, he could barely move the wind. And yet, the throne endured. Because the papacy had learned its final lesson. If you cannot command history, you become its ghost. Then came the man who changed everything. Not by power, but by presence. In Karol Wojtyla became Pope John Paul II, the first non-Italian pope in over 450 years. He didn't just wear the robes, he walked in them. He traveled, spoke, embraced. He visited 129 countries, kissed the ground, stood in stadiums filled with the faithful and the skeptical alike. He didn't reign like a pope, he moved like a prophet. And still, it sucked to be him. Because even as cameras flashed and pilgrims wept, his every step was shadowed. He was shot in 1981, in St. Peter's Square, by a lone gunman. He nearly died. And when he recovered, he visited his would-be assassin in prison. Spoke to him. Forgave him. But behind that gesture was a deeper reality, that the papacy, no matter how beloved, remained a target, still watched, still doubted, still stained. The medieval papacy had feared knives in the dark. Now, the fear came with microphones and headlines. With scandals, not sieges. With doubt, slow, persistent, dripping through every marble crack. By the time Pope Benedict XVI stepped down in 2013, the first resignation in over 600 years, the world finally saw what had always been true. The chair of Peter was never eternal. It only looked that way from far away. Up close, it was always just a seat too heavy for one man to carry. Today, the Pope still wears white, still waves from the window, still blesses, still forgives, but something is different. The power is softer now. It hums instead of roars, and for all its cathedrals and saints, the papacy now feels more like a memory being curated than a kingdom being ruled. So why does it matter? Why did it ever? Because buried beneath the politics, the gold, the betrayals, and the blood, there was something. A question. A longing. A flicker of hope that someone, somewhere, could speak to God on our behalf, not to control us, but to understand us. And maybe that's why it hurt so much when the popes failed, because they weren't just priests, they were mirrors. And sometimes, the scariest thing about a mirror is what it doesn't show. Every institution becomes its own echo eventually, and the papacy, once a thunderclap in the soul of Europe, now spoke in the language of shadows. It's hard to see it, at first. The Pope still sits, still smiles, still blesses crowds from balconies tall enough to swallow doubt. But listen longer, and the weight changes. What was once command has become tone. Not prophecy, but performance, and in some quiet, unspeakable way, maybe it always was. What survived of the medieval papacy by the 21st century was less a crown than a choreography. The procession. The Latin chant, the turning of pages, the incense lifted toward heaven like smoke from a house still burning beneath the floorboards. But those flames no longer threatened from without. Now, they smoldered from within. The scandals didn't begin in the modern era, they simply lost the ability to hide. In the medieval world, sins could be buried, bought, silenced, forgotten in the river of time. But now, a whisper in Boston echoed in Rome, a document leaked in Ireland trembled in Argentina, and beneath the gold-trimmed vestments, the church could no longer pretend. Children, secrets, silences that weren't holy, just cruel. The papacy found itself no longer accused of mere corruption or ambition, but of complicity. And perhaps, that's the wound that doesn't close, not because it's too big, but because it was carried too long. Pope Benedict XVI, scholar and theologian, inherited the throne in 2005. But what he really inherited was a church on fire, and a bucket full of Latin. He tried to preserve the beauty. Tried to retreat to doctrine. Tried to hold the past like a relic in shaking hands. But the world kept asking questions he wasn't prepared to answer. He wrote, spoke, reached backward to Aquinas and Augustine, as if they could explain how holiness broke apart in courtrooms and headlines. And in 2013, he did something unthinkable. He walked away. He resigned. No pope had done so willingly in nearly 600 years. And it wasn't fanfare. It was quiet. Monastic. A surrender, not of belief, but of the illusion that belief alone could fix what power had hollowed out. The image of Benedict, head bowed, coat fluttering in the helicopter's wind as he left the Vatican for the last time, felt like something out of a different century, not a fall. A fading. The kind of moment you don't understand until later, until you feel how cold the marble gets when the doors finally shut. Then came Jorge Mario Bergoglio. Pope Francis, first from the Americas, first Jesuit, first to take the name of a saint who embraced poverty like a second skin. He wore the white like it was linen, not armor. He spoke in metaphors, not mandates. He washed the feet of prisoners, ate in silence with the homeless. And the world, so used to grandeur, paused. Could the Pope be human again? Could he laugh, grieve, admit that the church had failed where it should have bled? Francis didn't claim infallibility. He carried something older, the weight of disappointment. But not as a burden, as an offering. Still, it sucked to be him. Because no pope enters a clean house, and his was filled with ghosts, the whispers of cardinals playing politics in the Sistine. The marble floors to name, the papal chambers with locks on drawers no one opens in daylight. He tried to address the sins, called commissions, met survivors, wept where his predecessors had stood dry-eyed. But institutions don't repent, people do. And sometimes, the machinery is too slow to follow its own soul. And yet, he kept going. Spoke of climate. Of the poor, of migrants drowned in salt and bureaucracy. He dared to say that being gay wasn't a sin, that capitalism had a conscience, that maybe, just maybe, the church should look more like the Christ it claimed. That didn't make him a prophet. It made him vulnerable. Because every pope since the Middle Ages had been trapped by the same paradox. If you speak too boldly, you fracture the throne. If you speak too softly, no one remembers your voice. So what remains now? A city-state the size of a park. A man in white who prays alone more often than not. A chapel painted with angels who can no longer stop the noise outside. The crowds still come. The cameras still click. But beneath the ritual, not just for holiness, but for certainty. And that's what the papacy used to sell. Not salvation, certainty, that someone was watching. That someone knew, that there was an order to the chaos. But now, even that certainty feels old, like a hymn hummed by a man who forgot the words halfway through. It's tempting to mourn the loss, to miss the drama of Gregory VII or the madness of the Cadaver Synod, to remember when popes could crown emperors and excommunicate kings with a single gesture. But power never really belonged in the Vatican. It just got comfortable there, and comfort is a strange kind of corruption. It doesn't poison. It numbs, so here we are. Not in the Middle Ages, not in the Renaissance, not even in modernity. Just here, looking at a throne that once and now barely stirs the wind. And maybe that's why it still matters, not because the Pope rules, but because he remembers. Every robe, every step, every silence, is a rehearsal for something older than power, not control. Witness, you don't have to believe to feel it. The weight, the ache, the echo. Because the Pope is no longer the voice of God, he's the memory of a time when we thought anyone could be. You have to go back, past the marble, past the Latin, past the triple tiaras and velvet processions, back to when the title wasn't yet a throne, just a cross to carry. Because before it sucked to be a pope. It was worse, it was unthinkable. Rome, late 1st century, the empire was at its height, but it moved like a wound, conquering, consuming, choking the light from smaller fires. And somewhere in the back alleys of that imperial machine, a man named Peter whispered prayers in a language the statues didn't understand. He wasn't called Pope. Not yet. Just bishop. A leader of a small, illegal flock. They met in catacombs, in courtyards, sometimes in abandoned houses, where the roof groaned as if afraid to listen. This was not glory. It was survival. Christianity, at the time, wasn't powerful. It wasn't respected. It was suspected. Of atheism, for refusing Roman gods. Of cannibalism, for whispering about body and blood. Of rebellion, for following a crucified criminal instead of Caesar. And being a bishop, being the voice others followed, was a death sentence you walked into voluntarily. Peter walked it anyway. They say he was crucified upside down, out of humility. Because he didn't think himself worthy to die the same way as Christ. He didn't wear white. He didn't sit on a throne. He died in dirt, in pain, in faith. That was the foundation. That was the first stone. The early church didn't build cathedrals. It built memory. Martyrs stitched themselves into the fabric of the faith. Polycarp. Ignatius. Clement. Names burned into manuscripts because their blood couldn't be forgotten. There were no popemobiles, no Swiss guards. No state visits, just men who wrote letters by candlelight, hiding from soldiers, knowing full well they'd be caught. Because faith, in those days, wasn't safe. It was fire. It moved underground, city to city. A letter from Rome would reach Antioch weeks later, smuggled and bread, read by trembling voices who knew it might be their last communion. So when did it change? When did being a pope go from death waiting to power claimed? The answer, like all slow deaths, is complicated. In 313 AD, the Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity with the Edict of Milan. The age of the martyrs ended. The church emerged from the shadows, blinking, scarred, unsure how to wear sunlight. And Constantine didn't just legalize the faith, he funded it. He gifted basilicas, endowed bishops, gave gold to the very people who once had only bread and fear. It seemed like a miracle. But miracles can have shadows, because once the church became legal, it also became useful. And a useful church could be shaped. Bishops now sat beside governors. The once hunted began to matter politically. And with power comes a new kind of fear, the fear of losing it. By the late 4th century, the Bishop of Rome was no longer just a voice in the dark. He was being called Papa, Father, and the world was listening. Rome fell in 476. The empire collapsed under its own contradictions. But the Bishop of Rome remained, the one Roman office that didn't die. And that is where it begins, the fusion of holy memory and secular vacancy. The Pope became not just the successor of Peter, but the last Roman standing, and the city, desperate for order. So you see, it didn't start with greed. It started with vacuum. A world unraveling. A people reaching for anything that still stood upright. Even when the gates burned. Even when the senators fled. Even when the aqueducts cracked and the wolves returned to the hills. And from that desperation, came, by the 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great would rise, not just as bishop, but as administrator of survival. Rome had no government, no emperor. And spread. Barbarians loomed. Gregory fed the people, sent missionaries to Britain, wrote prayers that would echo for centuries. He didn't want the power. But sometimes, the worst thrones are the ones you sit in because no one else will. And once he sat, the world never let the Pope stand freely again. The Middle Ages swallowed the Church like fog. And the papacy, now fully enthroned, had traded danger for burden. To be Pope was to live under expectations that no man could survive. To be holy and political. To be eternal and terrified, to speak for God in a language shaped by kings. No one walked away unscarred. Because every pope, even the worst of them, inherited a chair carved from contradiction. So yes, it sucked to be a medieval pope. But it sucked worse to be the one who made the papacy necessary, to build the house you'd never live in. To die for a kingdom you'd never see. Peter did not wear a ring. He did not command armies. He prayed, he fled, he preached, he was hunted. And he died upside down. That's the spine of the story. Everything else, the robes, the riches, the rituals, are just what time does to bones. It decorates them, builds museums around them, forgets what they were made to carry. Being Pope was never supposed to be a crown. It was a weight. A reminder that to speak in the name of love and justice is to invite the hatred of power, and to survive isn't always a blessing. So when you see the marble halls, the candlelit choirs, the Latin echoing through domes, don't see a palace, see a tomb built around a whisper that said, "Feed my sheep," and was answered, centuries later, with gold. Not all cages are iron, some are painted with saints, and when you are Pope, truly, medieval Pope, the bars are carved. You may wear white, but your days are stained. With ritual. With surveillance. With weight that no man, no matter how devout, could carry cleanly. Because the worst part of being Pope in the Middle Ages wasn't the politics. It was the hours. You didn't wake when you wanted to. You woke when the bells told you. Matins before sunrise, then lauds, then mass. A day structured not by desire, but by liturgy. The monastic rhythm grafted onto the flesh of power. Even in Rome, surrounded by wealth, silks, and the murmurs of cardinals, your time was never yours. Every moment bent toward obligation. Every step rehearsed. You walked corridors not as a man, but as an office, a symbol in motion. The throne in the Lateran or, later, St. Peter's, wasn't just symbolic. It was uncomfortable, all-backed, rigid, barely cushioned. You didn't sit in it. You held position in it. Like a soldier waiting for orders that came only from silence. Even how you breathed was observed. Even how you blinked could be interpreted as favor or disdain. Because the Pope didn't have moods, he had meaning. Every visitor was a calculation. A king knelt, but he carried a letter of demands folded in his sleeve. An archbishop bowed, but only to leverage the next diocese. Even your own servants, chamberlains, scribes, advisors, had ears turned outward. Loyalty was never total. Only strategic. And somewhere between the excommunications, indulgence debates, heresy trials, and the tangled web of canon law, you might begin to forget your own name. most popes didn't start in power. They started in monasteries, quiet places, places where silence had meaning, where prayer was allowed to breathe. And when they were chosen, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes through ambition's smoke, they were removed from that stillness forever. No more silence, only ceremony. Let's talk about the ritual, because it's easy to romanticize it now. To see the gold vestments, the incense floating like breath in winter, the Latin echoing through domes, and think it was all divine. But for the Pope, it was performance, and it was exhausting. Every robe had weight. Every procession had sequence. Every gesture had to be precise, choreographed, and spiritually correct. Motion, a hand lifted too early, a blessing too slow, could be read as weakness. Or worse, heresy. You didn't eat in peace. Meals were formal. Attendants stood nearby, watching. You couldn't speak freely. Every word was remembered. Recorded. Some popes had food tasters, not because they feared poison constantly, but because once is enough. Some refused certain dishes entirely. Fish from the Tiber, wine sent from outside Rome, bread not baked within the Leonine walls, because paranoia wasn't a flaw. It was your only protection. And sleep? Brief, interrupted. A pope didn't just retire to bed. He had attendants dress him in light. A guard stood at the door, another near the window. Letters waited by the bed in case of emergency, diplomatic updates, reports from distant monasteries, visions written by monks who claimed to have dreamed of the Virgin weeping over the Tiber. Some popes slept alone. Others did not. That's the part history tries to clean. But the Vatican walls know. Desire doesn't disappear with coronation. It just moves underground. You had confessions to hear. Not just from the poor, from kings, from war criminals, other clergy who had fallen so far that even the angels wouldn't look down. You were the only soul in the world allowed to absolve. And some days, it felt like drowning, because there's a point where hearing that much darkness doesn't make you holy. It just makes you gray. Pope Celestine V was canonized a saint, but before he was saint, he was terrified. A hermit, gentle, solitary, sincere, chosen by a divided college of cardinals out of desperation. They thought he could heal the church. He barely lasted 5 months. He couldn't handle the pressure, the manipulation, the endless rhythm of demands, so he resigned, and was imprisoned by his successor. He died in a cell. A saint. A failure. A man who is not a crown, it's a coffin for certain kinds of souls. Pope Boniface VIII, the very man who jailed Celestine, was his opposite. Assertive. Grand. Ambitious. He declared in Unam Sanctum that submission to the Pope was necessary for salvation. He stood against kings, demanded control, tried to make the papacy into a living empire. He ended up captured, beaten, humiliated. He died soon after, some said mad, others said haunted, because the throne he tried to command had already started slipping out from under him. And it's hard to rule when you're falling. So no, it wasn't just bad to be a pope in a medieval war. Or a pope under siege. It was bad to be a pope in peace. Sit alone in a chamber that echoed with ghosts. To watch bishops fight over appointments while peasants starved 2 streets away. To read letters by candlelight from monasteries reporting visions of the Antichrist, only to find out later those monks were starving or mad. To be called Holy Father by people who would poison you by week's end if it meant advancing their family name. To be asked for miracles by people who would not see your humanity if it walked naked in front of them. It sucked to be a pope. Not because you were hated, but because you were needed. And the kind of need the world placed on the papacy was never healthy. Never human. You were a symbol. And symbols are not allowed to break. Even when they do. The church called it canon law. A name that sounds clean. Precise, like a library of sacred reason. But in truth, it was a maze. 1,000 rules written to bind the soul, govern the body, and protect the institution. And at the center of that maze, forced to live by every line of it, sat the Pope. Not as its master, but as its prisoner. Most imagine that being Pope meant freedom, that you could do anything, say anything, command anything. But medieval canon law didn't work like that. It wasn't a rope you held. It was a rope wrapped around you, knotted by centuries of councils, edicts, and contradictions. Every pope inherited that rope. And most were strangled by it, slowly, ceremonially. It started with Gratian, a monk in the 12th century. He tried to make sense of it all, the chaos, the conflicts, the ancient rulings stacked like bones. His decretum, a compilation of canon law, didn't simplify the church. It institutionalized it. Made it solid. Sharp. Law now had precedent. Cases, commentaries, consequences. Being pope meant knowing the law better than the men trying to trap you with it. Or worse, pretending you did. If a pope changed a doctrine too quickly, he could be accused of heresy. If he refused to clarify, he could be called negligent. If he altered legal procedure without precedent, cardinals could argue he'd invalidated his own authority. There was no winning move. Only delays. Only evasions. The Pope might be the vicar of Christ, but canon law was the invisible council always watching over his shoulder, and it never slept. Consider this. To become Pope, the man had to be canonically elected by the College of Cardinals. That sounds simple now. But in the 13th and 14th century, it meant being voted in by men who were also your enemies. Men placed there by rival families, foreign monarchs, and bribes passed through generations. Any accusation of simony, buying or influencing the office, could render the entire election invalid. So the newly elected pope had to act quickly before his own law could unravel him. Some popes didn't even make it through their first year. Celestine IV lasted just 17 days. No coronation. No public appearance. Just a name entered into the scrolls before being erased by time. He died not as a ruler, but as a legal footnote. Because the system wasn't designed to protect holiness, it was designed to preserve stability, and sometimes, that meant the pope himself was expendable. If the election was contested, as it often was, you'd get something worse. Anti-popes, rival claimants to the throne, each with their own following, their own declarations, their own claims to righteousness. And worse, their own canon lawyers from Rome. Anti-popes who ruled from Avignon, Pisa, and later even within Rome itself. Imagine being the true pope and knowing that thousands of priests around the world were praying in the name of your enemy. That the body of Christ, at least politically, had been split straight down the spine. That no matter what robes you wore, a third of the Christian world believed you, and could quote canon law to prove it. The documents multiplied. Papal bulls, apostolic letters, decretals, conciliar rulings. Every pope inherited not just spiritual authority, but the most tangled legal archive in Europe. And each time they wrote something new, it became precedent for every pope after them. A paper chain, looped through history, getting heavier and more brittle with each link. Then came the conciliar movement. A heresy disguised as a reform. It argued that councils, gatherings of bishops and theologians, had more authority than the Pope himself. The Council of Constance in 1414 didn't just try to fix the Western Schism. It tried to redefine the papacy. They deposed multiple popes at once, held legal proceedings, declared that the council's authority came directly from Christ, and that popes were bound to obey. This wasn't just theology, it was mutiny, and for a while, the Church almost followed it. Pope Martin V, elected to restore unity, accepted their help, but never their authority. He began to reassert papal supremacy. But he couldn't erase the precedent. Canon law had absorbed the idea that the Pope could be judged. Even if only, in cases of manifest heresy. It was like giving a knife to the man behind you and telling him not to use it unless he was absolutely sure. Every pope since felt that knife. Inside the Vatican, there were men, canon lawyers, scribes, archivists, whose entire job was to track, not to interpret them for God. But to a terrifying irony. The Pope was the supreme lawgiver. But also its most likely casualty. This is what people never understand. That spiritual authority and legal survival were two different skill sets. You could be a saint and still be deposed. You could be a genius and still be excommunicated. You could be the anointed successor of Peter, and still be buried in your name struck from the registry, and your legacy swallowed by a better lawyer. Some popes fought back. Declared themselves above law, but every declaration had to be written. Reviewed. Approved. stored, and once it was part of canon law, it became binding. Even on future popes. So if you declared yourself untouchable in 1274, and another pope reversed it, the contradiction just sat there, unresolved, waiting to be weaponized. The papal archive became less a sanctuary and more an arsenal. And every new pope had to walk through it unarmed. In theory, the pope was infallible when speaking ex cathedra, from the chair. But the chair, by then, was surrounded by books with teeth, and in many ways, to speak from it was to gamble. Because if you slipped, if you spoke out of turn, declared something unsupported, or too easily, the echo would outlast you, and become part of the trap you just expanded. It sucked to be pope. Not because you were above the law, but because you were inside it. And the longer you ruled, the deeper it wrapped around you. Not to elevate. To bind. Because in the medieval mind, the church was not supposed to bend, so every pope who tried to shift its weight, found himself slowly ossified in parchment and fear. You can survive many things in life: war, scandal, even power. But architecture changes you. Stone remembers what flesh tries to forget. And if you're pope, if you are the still point inside the spinning storm of the medieval church, then your world is made of stone. It surrounds you, echoes you, seals you in. They call it the Vatican, but that word hides more than it reveals, because this place wasn't built for comfort. It wasn't built for safety. It was built for immortality. And nothing immortal ever cared much for the living. The moment you are elected pope, the world around you changes not metaphorically, literally. Your home becomes a fortress, not a symbolic one, a real one. Walls thick enough to muffle screams. Corridors designed to confuse. Is so dark you could walk them for weeks without seeing daylight. The apostolic palace, the Lateran before it, the papal apartments, these weren't houses. They were containers. A pope, once enthroned, did not leave often. He moved within an architectural bloodstream designed to keep him in place. Always watched. Always guided. Always turned inward. There's a strange thing that happens in cathedrals. You whisper, and it lingers. The acoustics were designed to elevate prayer, but they also amplify fear. You couldn't walk a hall without hearing your own breath echo back in judgment. You couldn't sit alone without feeling as if someone, or something, was listening. Because it probably was. In the Middle Ages, privacy wasn't a right. Especially not for popes. Your chambers were entered by servants, scribes, bodyguards, confessors, and cooks. You were never alone. But you were never truly with anyone either. A sacred loneliness, a constant presence of absence. You might dine with 15 men, but every one of them was trained to avert their gaze when you looked up. To smile without intimacy, to obey without affection. Because the Pope was, and holiness is hard to touch. Sleep was ritual. Not rest. You didn't simply retire. You were escorted. Robed. Prayed over. Even the bed was a symbol. Canopied, high, sometimes draped in crimson, sometimes white. Too many popes died in them for them to ever feel like comfort. Too many dreams in those rooms had ended in poison, betrayal, or exile. Some popes kept candles burning all night. Some refused to face windows. Some, like Urban VI, slept with bodyguards outside the door and daggers hidden in books. Not because they were paranoid, but because they'd seen what the Vatican does to a man who closes his eyes for too long. There were secret passages, not rumors, real tunnels connecting the papal chambers to the Castel Sant'Angelo, the ancient Roman fortress turned last resort refuge. Clement VII used it in 1527, when Rome burned and his own people turned against him. He fled across the rooftops, down hidden steps, into the guts of a city trying to eat its own father. That's not legend, that's architecture. The Vatican was built for escape. Which means it was never meant to be safe. The art, so often admired today, was not always beautiful. Not to them. A fresco of the Last Judgment isn't calming when you are the man charged with judgment. A painting of St. Peter crucified upside down isn't inspiring when you sleep in the room next to his tomb. The saints weren't decoration. They were reminders that holiness has a body count. That heaven might still require you to bleed. The courtyards weren't places for leisure. They were for appearances, controlled walks, calculated sunlight. Moments choreographed for ambassadors and the occasional brave monarch who still believed in the divine right of popes. Every step you took under the sky had been swept, rehearsed, and reported. Because the pope in public was not a man. He was a narrative. One wrong move, one twitch of the eye, and you'd find it copied into a dozen letters by nightfall. Inside the Vatican Library, revered today as a sanctuary of knowledge, there was something colder. Records of crimes, of trials, confessions, volumes of testimony, correspondence between bishops and popes detailing betrayals, heresies, bribes, some of it written in cipher, some burned, but much of it preserved. Because popes were not above memory, they were its most frequent victims. You had an office, but it wasn't yours. The chair had been sat in by men who died in shame. The desk had been touched by fingers stained with blood and ink alike. The windows looked out on a city that once crowned you a king, and might kill you by morning. There was a moment, sometime in the 1300s, when a French cardinal named Jacques Fournier became Pope Benedict XII, a former inquisitor. He renovated the papal palace in Avignon, adding a tower, a private chamber, sealed tight, nearly unreachable. He spent much of his away, not because he feared others, but because he knew too well what power does when it walks freely. You see, the Vatican was never just a place. It was a system. A living body. It breathed through couriers. It digested gossip. It exhaled ritual. And if you weren't careful, it would consume you. Not all at once, bit by bit. Your voice, your laughter, your certainty. Until all that remained was the mask. The white, the blessing hand that trembled slightly, though no one dared to ask why. This is why so many popes grew old too fast. Why some went mad. Why others simply dissolved. They weren't weak, they were devoured by the very machine that claimed to protect them. And that's what no tourist sees. Behind the museums, behind the paintings and guided whispers, there is a silence inside those walls, a silence shaped not by God, but by the memory of men who tried to be Him. And learned too late that heaven doesn't live in stone. He begins to forget his name, not all at once, not in the way age forgets, but in the way roles consume. They called him Father, Holiness, Successor. They signed letters in his name, wrote histories with it, blessed it with ink and wax. But in the quiet, when the doors closed, and the Latin faded into breathing, he could no longer remember how it felt to be called anything else. This is the real weight of being Pope. Not crowns. Not armies, not robes or bulls or battles. But the slow elf. The medieval world didn't care for the individual. It venerated the office, and once you put on the white, once you accepted the ring, the mitre, the burden, you ceased being a man. You became a function, the voice of God, the axis of doctrine. The anchor of heaven on earth. There was no place for fear, and yet it crept in anyway. Not in screams, in silences. In public, you were infallible. In private, you had doubts that would have scorched the walls if spoken aloud. You may have knelt before the crucifix each morning. But you'd also seen behind the curtain. You knew how relics were traded like currency, how canonizations could be bought, how the name of a saint might be attached to a corpse that had never known peace. You knew which bishops had children hidden in convents, which cardinals poisoned their rivals slowly, with prayers on their lips. You knew that every miracle required a witness, and every witness could be paid. And still, you had to stand on the balcony and speak of truth, because to hesitate was to rupture the entire world. This is how popes broke, not in fire, but in ritual, repeated until the soul became a reflection. Until you could perform the Mass perfectly, without believing a single word. Some popes were chosen because they were political pawns, some because they were too old to resist the wishes of younger men, and some, because they believed. And those are the ones who suffered most. Because they entered the papacy thinking it was sacred. And they died knowing it was something else. Pope Benedict IX was made pope in his 20s. He sold the office once, took it back, sold it again. A joke in history books, but beneath that joke is a boy, handed the keys to the kingdom before he had learned to stand upright. No one asks what that kind of power does to the spine. No one asks what it means to be called the vicar of Christ when you've barely learned to love anything beyond yourself. Pope Innocent III, brilliant, authoritative, devoted, called himself the vicegerent of God on earth, and he may have believed it. But belief becomes dangerous when you're surrounded by those who feed it for profit. Every confirmation of your holiness was another nail sealing the coffin of your humanity. You couldn't be wrong. Not in public. Not even in confession. There were no safe places to unravel. And so the unraveling happened. Inward. First your doubts became shadows, then your prayers became obligations, then your sleep became shallow, and then you stopped calling yourself I. There are records of popes speaking of themselves only in the third person. Not out of pride. Out of separation. Because he, the Pope, was not you. He was a role, a sacred mask that spoke words older than your lungs, a figure everyone believed in. And one you could no longer feel. There are stories, never verified, always whispered, of popes who kept journals they burned each night, pages where they spoke like children. Prayed not to be watched, wrote names they had not heard in years, not saints, not kings, just the name of a mother, a brother. A lover never spoken of again. And each night, they'd set the parchment to flame. Because what the church loved in you, it could not love in him. A pope could not confess weakness, not to his advisors, not to his confessors, not to God, not really, because God, in their minds, already was him. So instead, they learned how to perform sorrow. They wept when they were supposed to. Fasted when it was expected. Gave alms in numbers large enough to silence rumors. And when it still wasn't enough, they not from the city. From themselves, some took to isolation. Kept chambers no one entered. Refused to eat, they claimed it was holiness, discipline. But it was the exhaustion of having to be a symbol every waking moment. Of wearing the mask until you forgot your own face beneath it. By the late Middle Ages, even the papal coronation ceremony had become a kind of foreshadowing. After the tiara was placed, a piece of flax would be set alight by a chamberlain. It burned fast. Gone in seconds, and as the smoke rose, he would whisper, "Sic transit gloria mundi, so passes the glory of the world." A reminder, a warning. A quiet funeral for the man who had just been crowned, because they knew. Every pope died before he was buried. And still, the people prayed to you, believed you held the keys to heaven. Asked you to bless their infants, forgive their wars, protect their harvests. They saw Christ's face in yours. Even if your hands were shaking. Even if your lips were dry. Even if you hadn't believed in anything for years but the silence between bells. It sucked to be pope. Because even when the church worshipped you, you knew, deep down, that none of it could reach the part of you that remembered being human. And that part had been silent for too long. There is no such thing as a clean election. Not when the throne in question claims to speak for God. You'd think that by the time a man becomes pope, he's been chosen by the Holy Spirit. That's the story they tell. It's the story even he must repeat. But the truth, whispered behind cloisters and stone. The Holy Spirit doesn't vote. Men do. And men, especially cardinals, always come with debts. The conclave, that secret of rite, that locked room ritual, wasn't always as sacred as it sounded. It was born from crisis. In 1268, Pope Clement IV died. The cardinals couldn't agree on his successor. For nearly 3 years, the seat of Peter remained empty. Deadlocked, cities waited. Kings grew impatient. And the people of Viterbo, where the cardinals had gathered, finally snapped. They locked the cardinals in their chamber, removed the roof, cut their food. And only then, under sun, rain, and starvation, did a pope emerge. They called it conclave, with key. And thus, the conclave was born. Not as a divine process, as a desperate one. By the High Middle Ages, the conclave had become a theater of tension. Cardinals entered with robes and prayers, but also alliances, ledgers, secret letters from monarchs. Some had been promised bishoprics, others had sons waiting to inherit land, and inside that locked room, the sacred became political. Votes traded like relics, favors sealed in candlelight. Whispers in Latin, laced with threat. A cardinal didn't need to want to be pope, he just needed to want someone else not to be. And so the vote splintered. Dozens of ballots, days, sometimes weeks, and every name written was a knife drawn silently, until finally, someone emerged. Not always the holiest, rarely the strongest, the least objectionable. And when that name reached the required majority, the room changed. Not with celebration. With silence, because everyone in that room knew what they'd just done. Not crowned a saint, but trapped a man. The new pope would protest, he had to. It was tradition to say, "I am not worthy," but sometimes, you could hear the trembling in his voice, and know he meant it. They dressed him. White robes. Red shoes, led him to the room of tears, a small, hidden chamber beside the Sistine Chapel. No frescoes, no windows, just here, alone for a brief moment, the new pope wept, sometimes with joy, sometimes with terror, often because he already knew what the job would cost. Then he returned, stepped out onto the balcony. The crowd below roared. And above it, the ancient announcement, Habemus Papam. We have a pope. But the man behind that voice, the one waving, blessing, smiling as if peace had settled on his shoulders, he was now the loneliest man on earth, because from the moment he accepted the white, he stopped belonging to himself. His decisions were no longer private. His schedule no longer his own. Even his thoughts would be dissected, theologized, filtered through councils and commentators. The very cardinals who elected him would now surround him, smiling, bowing, pressing close, like vultures pretending to be disciples. They weren't finished. They were inside it. The curia, the Vatican's administrative body, was less a government than a machine. It didn't care who the pope was, it cared that the machine kept moving. And any pope who tried to change it quickly discovered. Machines do not take orders from their operators, they consume them. The College of Cardinals had its own hierarchies, its own rivalries. There were the crown cardinals, those appointed by monarchs, loyal to dynasties. Curial cardinals, bureaucratic elites, masters of doctrine and delay. Reformers, always a minority, always watched. And careerists, who served no ideal but their own assent. They didn't need to assassinate a pope. They could starve his policies, block appointments, whisper to envoys, forge alliances with embassies that reached deeper into the church than the pope himself ever could. And the pope? He smiled. Blessed. Raised the host. But behind closed doors, he began to retreat. Not into mystery. Into survival. Some tried to fight. Pope Gregory VII, in the 11th century, challenged emperors and reformed simony in exile. Others, like Pope Adrian IV, the only English pope, tried to stand firm to death on a fly that foot while drinking. A footnote. Even in death, they weren't afforded dignity. Then there were the ones who tried to outmaneuver the system. Pope Sixtus IV placed nephews in power, inventing the cardinal nephew tradition. An effort to create loyalty through blood. It worked, until it didn't. Nepotism became institutional. A word to believe that only family could be trusted. Even that failed. Because in Rome, betrayal was not the exception. It was the rhythm. Some popes chose silence, not just in public. In everything. They became ceremonial figures, signed what was placed before them, spoke only in prepared addresses, let the curia lead while they wandered through gardens alone, feeding birds. A quiet resistance, the refusal to play a role in their own, but even that had its price, because the less they ruled, the more others did. And when death came, it was just another conclave waiting. The body wasn't mourned as a man. It was prepared, processed, displayed, a vessel, emptied and blessed. And the college began again. Not in grief, in calculation. So yes, it sucked to be pope, because even if you believed, deeply, truly, you would one day stand before God. You had to stand before a room of men first. And they would not ask about your faith, they would ask about your usefulness, your alliances, your survival. The white didn't mean purity. It meant visibility. And when all the lights are turned toward you, you either shine or burn. You are told you are Christ's voice, but you still bleed when you cut your hand. You are told you hold the keys to heaven. But at night, you still wake from dreams that feel too much like memory. No matter how many times you bless, ordain, absolve, no matter how carefully the incense curls around your shadow, you are still one thing the church cannot sanctify: human. And no one around you wants to see that. The further you rise in holiness, the harder it is to speak plainly, to say, "I'm tired. I'm afraid. I don't believe this anymore." There is no room for those words inside a marble throne room. There is only role, performance. And in time, the Pope begins to vanish into that performance. A strange thing happens in the minds of those who watch you. The people, the faithful, they begin to forget that you become a symbol, timeless, unchanging, photographed in the same pose, framed by the same windows, always in white, always upright, always steady. But inside, your back hurts, your hands shake. Your eyes don't see the texts as clearly anymore. You kneel slower, and some days, not at all, because divinity is an expectation. But the body doesn't follow expectations. It breaks. Pope Clement VI reigned during the Black Death, a pandemic that claimed as much as half of Europe's population. They begged him for answers, for protection, for hope. And he gave it, publicly. He blessed the sick, ordered processions, wrote letters reminding the world that God had not abandoned them. But privately, he stayed indoors, kept fires burning around him constantly, hired doctors, isolated. Because even the Pope knew, faith may move mountains, but it does not kill plague. And there's the fracture again, the thing that makes the papacy unbearable. To stand between two worlds. The one that sees you as more than mortal. And the one that proves, every day, that you're not. Many popes suffered illnesses in silence. It wasn't strength. It was necessity. A sick pope weakened the church. So diseases were hidden, symptoms denied, feverish decisions masked behind Latin ceremony. Some popes ruled in physical agony for years. Others had strokes, were partially paralyzed, and still carried through audiences as if nothing had changed. Because visibility wasn't optional, it was ritual. Imagine waking up knowing that your name is being sung across a continent, while you can barely lift your head off the pillow. Imagine seeing pilgrims walk for weeks, believing you carry a divine spark in your touch, when you haven't felt warmth in your hands in months. Imagine confessing your deepest fear only to a wooden crucifix in a chapel too cold to echo. Because you know, there is no one around you who will see you if you speak it aloud. Only the title. Only the Pope. Some popes developed obsessions: cleanliness, silence, repetition. They rearranged objects in their chambers with precise geometry. They wrote the same phrases over and over in their private books. Not madness, not always, but a search for control in a life where nothing was theirs. Not their meals, not their movement. Not even their prayers, because even their prayer had to be scripted, witnessed, confirmed. You couldn't just pray. You had to perform prayer. There's a reason some popes asked to be buried simply. No procession. No crown. No embalming. Just a body. Returned to dust. Unwatched, because death, for them, was the first moment since election where they didn't have to act. But death wasn't always simple. A pope's final days were often the most watched. Cardinals circled like patient creditors. The curia prepared transition plans. The faithful outside wept, though most had never seen the man up close. And inside the papal apartment, someone who had once been a scholar, a monk, a priest, now lay under blankets he no longer recognized. Listening to whispers in the next room, wondering if his last breath would even be his own. The moment he died, the ritual began. A silver hammer tapped gently on his forehead 3 times. His baptismal name was called. No answer. Declared dead. His fisherman's ring, the symbol of his authority, was broken. And with it, the man disappeared completely. Not into God. Into process. It sucked to be pope. Because the only way to escape the role, was to die. And even then, you were embalmed into legend. A story told in future conclaves, used to justify policies you never believed in, quoted by men who had once called you Holy Father, but had never once asked how you were sleeping. So what did the Pope think in those last moments? Did he believe? Did he still think heaven was listening? Or had the weight of centuries, the gold, the law, the rituals, the betrayal, made it impossible to tell where God stopped and the Church began? And maybe that's the real wound. The one no crown can cover. That a man, any man, might spend his final years being adored by millions, and still feel like no one sees him, because popes were not just leaders, they were mirrors, and every person who knelt before them saw what they wanted to see. A savior. A tyrant. A symbol of endurance, a relic of guilt. But rarely a man. And when the incense faded, when the crowds went home, when the white vestments were folded one last time, the body left behind was just that. A body, cold, tired, free. The world needs a center. That's the old idea, a fixed point around which everything else can turn. The sun in the model. The heartbeat in the chest. The voice in the crowd that never trembles. In the medieval imagination, the Pope was that center. He didn't just represent truth, he was its living axis. The final word when kingdoms disputed, when souls doubted, when theology tore itself apart. And like all centers, he was meant to be still. But here's the thing. Stillness, when it's required, isn't peace. It's paralysis. Every answer passed through him. Every quarrel between bishops. Every appeal from a monastery forgotten by time. Every whisper of heresy, every marriage dispute, every theological wrinkle that Europe couldn't iron out on its own, landed at the Pope's feet. And in each case, his word was final, his signature divine. Or asked what it cost to speak like that, to declare certainty, when inside, you felt none. There is a paradox in papal power. The more people depend on your certainty, the less you are allowed to question. Doubt becomes dangerous, not just to your soul, but to theirs. Because if the Pope wavers, what happens to the chain of faith that hangs from him like a chandelier? What happens to 1 billion prayers, if the man at the end of them stares at the ceiling and hears nothing? A Pope could never say, I don't know. He could never say, I'm not sure. He could never sit in silence too long, heavily on metaphor. The faithful wanted answers. The princes wanted declarations. The heretics needed condemnation. He was not allowed to search. He had to pronounce. Some popes compensated with absolutism, drew bold lines, wrote encyclicals that split centuries. In here, salvation there. A kind of theological violence disguised as clarity. Not because they were cruel, but because they were afraid. Afraid that nuance would fracture the illusion. That the scaffolding of divine authority would collapse under the weight of maybe, so they made themselves hard, sharp, and in doing so, they lost whatever softness remained in them. Others went the opposite way. They spiritualized their silence, spoke rarely, let ambiguity grow like moss over the walls of doctrine. They would sit for hours in the gardens, staring at statues. Not just breathing, trying to remember what it felt like to believe before belief was a job description. But belief is a muscle. And when unused, when replaced by duty, title, performance, it atrophies, until eventually, you begin to wonder, do I believe in God? Or do I believe in the idea of being believed in? And that question, that quiet, interior rupture, was the question no pope was allowed to ask out loud. Because the Pope was not a seeker, he was the destination. The one place in all of Christendom where the answer was supposed to already live. Even when it didn't. Imagine what that does to a man. To know that every prayer ending with Amen might land on you like snowfall. To know that when someone asks, what is the truth, you are required to speak as if truth himself had briefed you over breakfast. And worse, to know that your own heart hasn't moved in, that your own faith has become scripted. A hollow theater echoing with verses you no longer feel. They don't tell you about that in seminary. They tell you how to celebrate Mass, how to study canon law, how to shepherd the faithful. But they don't tell you how to stand on a balcony and smile when you feel like you've disappeared inside your own skin. They don't tell you how to hold the Eucharist and wonder, not if it's true, but if you're still capable of knowing what true, even means. The medieval church feared, but the heresy that broke the popes didn't come from outside. It was born inside the self. The faith, once institutionalized, stops being an act of love and starts being an instrument of control. That maybe, just maybe, holiness and hierarchy cannot live in the same house. And once that thought takes root, you can't unthink it. You can only hide from it. Behind vestments, behind Latin, behind centuries of expectation. Some popes did hide. Perfectly, flawlessly, so well that they forgot they were hiding. They smiled. Wrote theological treatises, blessed armies but they had already gone hollow. You could see it in their eyes, if you looked long enough. The light was there, but no warmth. To be the center of Christian certainty in the medieval world was to die by inches. Because God does not whisper clearly into marble, and certainty, if manufactured too long, becomes delusion. And delusion, when shared by enough people, becomes doctrine. And doctrine, when calcified into stone and sealed with gold, becomes a prison. And someone has to live in that prison. Usually, a man called Pope. It's tempting to think they had power, that they were kings in cassocks, monarchs of the spirit. Untouchable. But power is a poor shield against despair, and when your despair is theological, when it's tied to every soul that looks to you for hope, it doesn't just ache. It rots. Some popes drank too much. Some indulged in secret pleasures. Some wrote strange confessions in code. Some screamed in their sleep. Some believed, fully, and still broke anyway, because certainty is a cruel god. It demands your full surrender, and gives nothing back but silence. And maybe that's the final cruelty of being a medieval pope. You were never allowed to say, "I'm still searching." Because the world believed you'd already arrived. There was a time when prayer meant presence, when a man folded his hands and felt not power, but proximity. To God. To silence, to something so still, so enormous, smaller, kinder. But for the Pope, the medieval Pope, presence was the first thing he lost. Not because he stopped praying, but because everything sacred became procedure, and presence cannot survive procedure. By the time he kneeled, the bells had already rung. The incense had been measured, the steps timed to match the chant. It was all holy. But nothing was alive. He bowed because it was written. He spoke because the rubric said so. And the silence the kind that bends the ribs inward, was gone. The Pope could not improvise his intimacy with God. That would have been unorthodox, suspicious, potentially scandalous. So instead, he traced the same circle every day. The same prayers, folded into the same hours. The same rituals with the same faces around him, nodding, recording, remembering. But inside, something hollowed. Because repetition, when stripped of vulnerability, doesn't make you devout. It makes you deaf. And slowly, the Pope stopped expecting God to speak back. He still asked, still read, still quoted. But the awe was gone. It had been replaced by something colder, doctrine. Doctrine is not faith. It's faith after it's been embalmed, preserved, filed, made safe for mass consumption. It gives you structure. It keeps the walls standing. But it does not burn. That's what presence was, a burning, a voice in the wind. A terrifying intimacy that made prophets drop their faces into the dirt. The kind of presence that makes you want to run and stay at the same time. And the Pope, once, long ago, had felt it. In his youth, maybe. In the quiet years, before the mitre, when prayer meant reaching, not reciting. Before his soul became a public utility, the Pope became a curator of absence. He stood inside cathedrals large enough to echo the silence. He watched worshippers cry as if they could feel something he hadn't in years. He envied them. Not their poverty. Not their simplicity. Their nearness. Because God, in the Middle Ages, had become an institution. Not a person. A system. A language. A throne. And the man seated on that throne was supposed to be God's representative. But also his replacement. And how do you love something you've been told you are? How do you long for a face you must wear daily? Pope John XXA, in the 14th century, debated whether the souls of the dead saw God immediately or had to wait for judgment. he wasn't just theorizing, he was wondering. Asking, in the only way a pope could. Will I ever see him again? But he didn't say it like that. He said it through encyclicals, through councils, through carefully phrased declarations, because he couldn't admit he was still hoping, still unsure. The world wanted a pope who knew, who had to know, who woke every morning with the breath of heaven in his lungs. But popes woke like anyone else, with pain in the knees, dry mouth, regret, and a calendar that reminded them just how many people expected answers they could no longer give. So instead of presence, they gave permanence, a structure that could outlive them. A theology that did not tremble. Even when they did. Cathedrals were built for permanence, stone on stone, spire toward heaven. Weight that would outlast the men who carried it. But no one asked what it felt like to be the man who had to carry it. The Pope couldn't afford collapse, so the structure did it for him. He didn't break, he petrified. You see it in their portraits, later ones, especially, the stiffness, the blank expression. The eyes fixed on a point beyond the viewer, not out of superiority, but distance. They had learned not to be seen. Not truly, because when the soul becomes doctrine, the man becomes invisible. The monasteries had tried to protect it. That intimacy, that stillness, but even they submitted eventually. To Rome. To canon law, to the weight of uniformity. Prayer became synchronized, silence became scheduled. Even solitude became a regulated virtue, and the Pope, the one who should have wandered deepest into the divine, was never alone long enough to remember what it felt like. Once, God walked with Adam in the garden. That was the dream. Presence, unmediated, unashamed. By the medieval period, that intimacy had been walled off behind miles of theology, and the Pope, the one closest to the gate, was also the one furthest from the garden, not by punishment, but by structure, not by sin, but by expectation. He had become too sacred to see clearly, too important to hear the whisper, too surrounded to sit in stillness without someone asking what time Mass was. This had become management. And presence had become something you pretended to remember. A pope could canonize saints, but couldn't grieve. Not publicly. Could write encyclicals about hope, but couldn't weep during Mass. Could lead the world in, but often didn't know how to say, I miss you, without choking. That's what it really meant to carry the Church. Not just the wars. Not just the laws, but the ache of being the last man expected to believe, and the first to feel how far away God had become. So yes, it sucked to be a medieval pope, because you didn't just live behind marble walls, you died behind theological ones, and no one mourns a man they mistook for an institution. You would think the weight ends with the body, that when the pope dies, when the final thing is broken, the curtains drawn, the burden of being him would die too. But it doesn't. Because institutions don't bury burdens, they redistribute them. The myth of the papacy isn't told by the Pope. It's told about him. Afterward. By others, by those who survived him. His silence becomes virtue. His indecision becomes mystery. His doubts are burned with his robes, and what's left is a version of the man that can't contradict anyone. A relic, polished, framed. The moment the body cools, the work begins, not the mourning, the myth-making. The scribes dip their quills, they record miracles, they soften controversies, they turn what was fragile into something majestic. And the man, whoever he once was, disappears beneath the story. Sometimes, that story becomes sainthood, but even when it doesn't, it becomes utility. The previous pope is used as precedent. As warning. As justification. His life is quoted. Misquoted. Weaponized in the next conclave, and the burden he carried, the expectation, the isolation, the crushing need to embody the divine, never really leaves the room. It just waits for the next man to wear it. The Church survives because it remembers, but sometimes, remembering is just another kind of forgetting. It forgets the nights the Pope couldn't sleep. The things he wrote and then destroyed, the friends he lost. The truths he dared not speak. It forgets that he was not Peter, not Paul. Not some divine monolith, he was a man. With a body that decayed like anyone else, with thoughts that couldn't always be baptized into doctrine. With moments, brief, unspeakable moments, where he stood before the altar and thought, "Is this all a performance?" and then walked out anyway. Because popes don't confess those thoughts, they absorb them. And carry them in silence. There's a phrase carved into old cathedrals, stat crux dum volvator orbis, the cross stands while the world turns. It's a beautiful sentiment. But beneath it is something heavier. The world must keep turning. And someone has to stand still to make that happen. Is that still point? The man who doesn't move, who doesn't crack, so when he dies, the structure doesn't break. It tightens, the vacancy is announced, the conclave summoned, and before the incense clears from the funeral, the machine has already begun to spin again. The cardinals mourn in scarlet, the bells toll, but the conversation, the real one, has already shifted. Who's next? Not who will love us, not who believes, just, who can hold the line. No one speaks of legacy at first. Because everyone knows legacy isn't shaped by how you lived. It's shaped by who remembers you last, and popes are remembered by the men who replace them. That is the final wound, that your soul is interpreted by strangers, that your failures become someone else's opportunity, that your voice, the one you sometimes couldn't find, becomes a footnote in another man's bull. Some popes were canonized quickly. Others were left to the dust. Some were remembered fondly by the people and coldly by the church. Some ruled long enough to see their reforms undone before they even died. Some were loved only after they could no longer change anything, because the dead pope is safest. The most manageable, the most obedient. There's an old Vatican rule. The pope cannot bind his successor. It means no pope can prevent the next from changing his decisions. It also means, everything you built can be undone. Every doctrine softened. Every reform reversed. Every carefully balanced piece shattered in a single new decree. All you can do is die knowing that none of it was truly yours. Not even the legacy. Some popes tried to shape their memory, wrote letters to be opened posthumously, dictated spiritual testaments, requested burial places that meant something personal, a monastery they loved, a church from their youth. But even those requests could be ignored. Because once you're dead, the church decides what kind of pope you were, and the man who once spoke for God now speaks through silence. Pope Formosus, you'll remember, was exhumed, put on trial. His corpse dressed in papal robes, his fingers broken, his body flung into the Tiber. They say it was politics, a grotesque miscarriage of spiritual justice, but maybe it was also the purest expression of papal memory. The church does not bury its popes, it repurposes them. And perhaps that's why being pope was so unbearable. Because no matter how you ruled, no matter what you believed, no matter how devout or depraved your reign, you would be remembered not as yourself, but as a position. A face in a painting. A sentence in a council. A line in a sermon. Used by others, spoken in tones you never used. Held up as example, or mistake. But never as man. Because to be pope was not to live for God. It was to die for structure. They tell you that the pope is the rock on which the church is built. What they don't tell you is that rocks crack, that beneath every cathedral is a foundation of fractured stone. Repaired, covered, blessed, but still broken. And perhaps the popes, one by one, knew this, felt it, lived it. They were not building the kingdom, they were trying to hold it together, even as it trembled under their feet. And so the burden never left with them. It stayed. In the walls, in the rituals, in the silence that follows every papal blessing. It clings, waiting for the next hand, the next voice, the next soul who dares to wear white. There is no retirement plan for a medieval pope. No garden to return to. No family hearth to sit beside, telling stories of what it all meant. There is only death, and before that, not dramatic, not even visible. Just slow, like light leaving a candle before the flame goes out. He wakes later than he used to. Not by choice, but because the body no longer obeys the clock of once, he would rise before the sun. Now the sun is already climbing the walls when he opens his eyes, and the first sound he hears is not the call of faith, but the ache of his own bones shifting under the weight of too many years spent pretending to be divine. His chamber is silent. Always, there is no laughter, no conversations that aren't reported. No visitor who does not bow. Sometimes he forgets what a human voice sounds like when it isn't asking for something. A blessing, a decision. A miracle. He remembers fewer names now. Not the saints, he could recite those in his sleep. But the faces of the people who once called him brother, not Holy Father, they fade. And he forgets how they used to make him feel. The warmth. The calm, the gentle frictions of friendship. They've been replaced by formality. By titles. By a sea of reverence that never touches the shore. His meals are lighter now. His robes heavier. Time plays strange tricks on the senses. The bread feels dense. The wine, once, tastes flat. He takes communion with trembling hands, and for the first time in years, he realizes he doesn't know if it comforts him anymore. Not because he doubts God, but because the God he once spoke to in the quiet feels so far away. He no longer writes. Not like before. The encyclicals have stopped. The bulls are dictated, not read. And in the space where his own words used to live, there is only a kind of gentle retreat. He begins to speak in shorter phrases, simpler Latin, longer pauses, not for effect, but because he's tired of speaking only to be interpreted. The cardinals keep their distance, not out of disrespect, out of anticipation. They see what he sees, the hesitation, the way he walks less like a ruler and more like someone unsure if he's still needed. They're right. The machinery is already preparing. He sits alone more often now. No audience, no pages, just him, and in that silence, memories begin to return. Not of power, not of doctrine, but of a smaller life, a wooden chapel, a first confession heard under candlelight. The tremble in his voice the first time he read the gospel aloud. These moments come back not as regrets, but as reminders that there was once something real underneath all this, before the robes, before the marble, before the titles wrapped around his name like vines. Sometimes, he thinks about crying. But he no longer remembers how to do it without permission. There are dreams. Not nightmares. Not visions, just fragments. He's walking through a monastery. His sandals scrape the stone. He sees a door at the end of a corridor. No guards, no gold. Just a door, and he knows, on the other side is God. Not the idea, not the institution. Just God. But in the dream, he never opens it. He just stands there, listening. In his final weeks, the prayers become different. Not longer. Not louder, just, softer. They no longer feel like proclamations. They feel like questions left at the feet of something older than doctrine. He stops asking to be forgiven. He starts asking to be seen. The pain is worse now. He hides it well. But some mornings, his attendants hear the way he exhales after standing. Not like a pope. Like an old man. And they glance at each other, and do not speak. Because the time is close, and they all know what happens next. There is no dramatic death, no thunder, no final line that reshapes the world. Just a morning where he doesn't wake, and the silence that follows, feels strangely clean. As if something has finally exhaled after years of being held in. The news spreads. A pope has died. The bells ring. The flags lower, and the world turns, just as it did before. Just as it always will. Inside his chambers, a simple wooden cross is placed beside the body. His ring, the fisherman's ring, is removed. Later, it will be struck with a hammer. Symbolic. The seal is broken. The reign is ended. And everything he once embodied. The prayers, the rituals, the impossible burden. Returns to the waiting arms of tradition. Ready to dress the next man in white. But for one moment, in the stillness before the doors open, he is simply a man again. Just a body. Just a name spoken only by God. No guards, no incense, no audience, only peace, and maybe, just maybe, his last thought, if such a thing can linger, was not of doctrine, or law, or legacy. But of a younger version of himself, kneeling in a chapel. Before all of this, before the centuries wrapped themselves around his shoulders, and hearing something then that he had not heard in decades, the sound of being known. And that is why it sucked to be a medieval pope. Because the world crowned you to carry heaven, but never gave you room to be human. And in the end, all you ever wanted, beneath the robes, beneath the marble, beneath the mask, was something so simple, so fragile, so unholy, that no one dared to ask if you still needed it. Just to be held. Not by history. Not by doctrine. Not by power. Just, held. By something real. By someone who didn't call you, just your name, just once, before the white swallowed you whole.